My phone lit up while I was elbow deep in a client's truck engine, grease smeared across my forearms, the smell of oil clinging to my skin. The name on the screen made my heart pause for exactly 3 seconds. Him, 13 months. That's how long it had been since I'd heard a single word from my ex-husband. 13 months since he stood in what used to be our living room and told me, calmly and confidently, that he needed to find himself. That being married to me was holding him back from becoming the man he was meant to be. I still remembered his exact words. I need space to discover who I am without being defined as someone's husband. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't ask him to stay. I looked at him that afternoon and said one word. Okay. He had been waiting for a breakdown. Tears. Panic. Some dramatic proof that leaving me would devastate my world. Instead, I called my attorney the very next morning. 4 months later, the divorce papers were finalized. When he signed them, there was confusion on his face, like he'd expected resistance, like he'd assumed I would fight to keep him. I didn't. I let him go and move forward with my life. So when his message appeared on my phone now, after all that silence, I didn't rush to open it. Hey, I know it's been a long time. I've done a lot of thinking. I'm done finding myself. I'm ready to come home. We can start over. I want to be your husband again. I read it twice. Then I locked my phone and went back to work. I didn't respond. Not that day. Not the next. 2 days later, the doorbell rang at exactly 3 in the afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone. I'll get it, Ryan called from the kitchen. My partner, my present, the man who now shared my home and my life. I heard the front door open. Then silence. The heavy kind. The kind that tells you everything is about to change. Can I help you? Ryan asked, polite but firm. I already knew who was standing there before I reached the hallway. My ex-husband stood frozen on the doorstep, a small suitcase in his hand, staring at Ryan like he'd just walked into the wrong life. And in that moment, I realized something with absolute clarity. He didn't come back because he loved me. He came back because he thought I'd been waiting. And he was about to find out just how wrong he was. I'm 36 now. The kind of age where people stop asking what you want to be when you grow up and start asking why you're not already settled, married, kids, mortgage, a life that looks neat from the outside. I work with my hands for a living. I run a small but growing auto shop that specializes in diagnostics and restoration, alternators, transmissions, vintage rebuilds, the kind of work that requires patience and precision. I've always liked problems with clear causes. Something either works or it doesn't. Something is either aligned or it isn't. People are harder, especially the kind who smile while they're already planning their exit. I met my ex-husband, let's call him Evan, 6 years ago. Back then, I was working as a lead technician at a dealership. Long days, constant noise, the kind of job that leaves your body sore but your mind sharp. Evan was the finance manager, always polished, always composed, always dressed like he belonged somewhere bigger than a dealership office. He had that kind of confidence that made other people lean in, like he was already successful and the rest of us were just watching him become more. He noticed me before I noticed him. At least that's what he told me later. He said he liked that I wasn't trying to impress anyone, that I didn't flirt my way into rooms, that I showed up, did my job, and didn't waste energy on performative charm. He made me feel chosen, which looking back is a dangerous thing to crave if you've spent most of your life being the reliable one. We started slow. Dinner after my shifts, weekend breakfasts where he'd talk about his goals like they were already inevitable, promotion, bigger income, a move to corporate, the life he was building. He'd reach across the table, squeeze my fingers and say, "You and me, we're going to have something real." I believed him. By the time we got married, everyone around us acted like it made perfect sense. Evan was stable, ambitious, well-liked. I was grounded, practical, loyal. We looked like balance. People love couples that feel like balance. And for a while it was. We bought a small place, built routines, split chores, made plans. He'd come home and kiss my cheek, tell me he missed me, then sit down and vent about coworkers, meetings, office politics. I would listen, really listen, because I thought that was what partnership meant. Being the person someone can come home to, even when they're not their best. But even in the early years, there were signs. Little ones. The kind you dismiss because you don't want to be the paranoid wife. Evan was charming in public, but impatient in private. He'd praise me in front of friends. "She's so capable. She can fix anything." But the minute we were alone, he'd critique the things that mattered to me. "Why do you still want to do shop work long term?" he'd ask, like it was a phase I should outgrow. It's not a real future, he'd say, like my future was only real if it looked like his. If I came home tired, he didn't ask if I was okay. He asked if I'd thought about switching careers yet. If I talked about expanding into my own garage someday, his response wasn't excitement, it was calculation. How much would that cost? What if it fails? Do you want to throw away stability for some hobby? At the time, I told myself he was just being practical. The truth was harder. He wanted control, not the obvious, loud kind. The quiet kind that slowly convinces you your instincts are childish. The thing about Evan was that he didn't scream. He didn't slam doors. He didn't cheat openly, at least not that I ever caught. His damage came in the form of certainty. He was always certain that his way was the smarter way. And somehow, over 6 years, that certainty started to seep into my bones. I began second-guessing things that used to feel natural. I started softening my voice, shrinking my opinions, choosing peace over truth because conflict exhausted me. And the worst part? I got good at it. When Evan and I fought, it was never about something obvious like infidelity or money missing from an account. It was always about who I was allowed to be, how much space I was allowed to take up in a life that was supposedly ours. And then there was Ryan. Back then, Ryan was just another coworker at the dealership. He worked parts and inventory, quiet, efficient, steady, the kind of man who didn't compete for attention because he didn't need it. I barely noticed him at first, because Evan made it clear Ryan was annoying. He's too friendly with the female techs, Evan would say, frowning like he was analyzing a threat. He tries too hard to be likable. He's fake. He's putting on an act. Ryan wasn't fake. He was just consistent. He'd say good morning and mean it. He'd ask if your day was going okay and wait for the answer. He'd stay late to fix inventory issues without announcing it like a sacrifice. And Evan hated him for that. I didn't realize it then, but Evan didn't hate Ryan because Ryan did something wrong. Evan hated Ryan because Ryan made being decent look effortless. And Evan's decency always came with conditions. If Ryan and I spoke at work, Evan would watch. Not openly, just enough that I'd feel it, like a small pressure behind my ribs. He likes you, Evan said once, casually, like he was commenting on the weather. I laughed it off. He's just friendly. Evan smiled, but it wasn't warm. Just don't be naive. I should have noticed how quickly he turned my kindness into something suspicious, but I didn't. I was too busy trying to be the kind of wife who kept her marriage smooth. So when Evan stood in our living room 13 months ago and told me he needed space to find himself, part of me wasn't surprised. It didn't come out of nowhere. There had been months of restlessness, late nights, networking, new clothes, a sudden obsession with being seen as more. He'd started speaking in phrases that sounded like they belonged in self-help podcasts. I feel stuck. I need to evolve. I don't want to wake up at 40 and realize I wasted my life. And every time he said it, he looked at me like I was the thing he needed to escape. When he finally left, he expected me to collapse. But something in me went quiet instead. Not numb, not cold. Just clear. If someone can walk away from you to discover themselves, what they're really saying is, I want the freedom to search for something better without the guilt of admitting you weren't enough for me. So I let him go, and I rebuilt. I didn't know yet that Ryan would become part of that rebuilding. I didn't know a different kind of love existed, the kind that doesn't require you to audition for your place. All I knew 13 months ago was that I refused to live as someone's backup plan. And now Evan was back, suitcase in hand, acting like the last year had been a temporary vacation from responsibility. Like I'd been sitting in a paused life, waiting for him to press play again. He didn't understand one simple thing. Life doesn't pause because someone leaves. It moves. It grows. It fills the space they abandoned. And mine already had. After Evan left, life didn't explode. That was the strangest part. There was no dramatic collapse. No nights of sobbing on the kitchen floor. No desperate calls begging him to reconsider. What followed instead was quieter, and in some ways, more unsettling. Silence. The first few weeks felt like walking through a house after a storm had passed. Everything looked the same, but something essential was missing. The air moved differently. I'd come home from work and instinctively reach for 2 mugs before catching myself. I'd cook out of habit, then remember there was no one to criticize the seasoning or ask why I'd chosen that recipe again. At night, the bed felt too wide. Not lonely exactly, just unfinished. Evan didn't call, didn't text, didn't check in. That hurt more than I expected. Because when someone claims they need space to find themselves, you assume they'll at least glance back to see if you're still standing where they left you. He didn't, and slowly that hurt hardened into something else. Clarity. I stopped filtering my thoughts through Evan's preferences. I worked later without guilt, took on side jobs I'd been putting off because he said they were beneath my potential. I started sketching ideas for my own shop again. Nothing official, just notes on napkins and margins of notebooks. For the first time in years, my future felt like it belonged to me. That was when Ryan reappeared in my life. Not dramatically, not intentionally. By accident. I ran into him at a parts supplier one afternoon, both of us reaching for the same box of components. He recognized me instantly, smiled like time hadn't passed, like my marriage dissolving hadn't altered the way he saw me. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said. Neither had I. We ended up talking longer than we planned. About engines, about old restorations, about the strange satisfaction of taking something broken and making it functional again. I didn't mention Evan at first. Ryan didn't ask. That mattered more than I realized. Eventually, the conversation drifted there naturally. I told him I was divorced. Just the fact, no explanation, no emotional dump. He nodded, didn't offer unsolicited advice or pity. "That can't have been easy," he said. "I'm glad you're still doing what you love." It was such a simple sentence, no implication, no expectation, just support. Over the next few weeks, we ran into each other again. Always accidentally, always brief, always comfortable. And then one afternoon, over coffee that was supposed to last 10 minutes, he mentioned something that made my ears perk up. "I'm thinking of leaving the dealership," he said, "starting my own automotive supply business. Inventory, specialty parts, logistics, but I don't know if I can do it alone." I stared at him, because for the first time in a long time, someone was saying the words Evan had always shut down before they could breathe. "You could," I said slowly, "if you planned it right." Ryan smiled. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." 3 conversations later, we had the beginnings of a business plan. Not romantic, not emotional. Practical, balanced, equal. That was the difference. Working with Ryan didn't drain me. It didn't feel like I was being evaluated. He listened, adjusted, challenged me when it mattered, but never made me feel small for dreaming. 6 months later, we opened the shop. 2 months after that, I realized something uncomfortable. I was thinking about Ryan when I wasn't with him. Not in a guilty way, not in a romantic fantasy way. In a respect way. I cared what he thought. I trusted his instincts. I looked forward to conversations that weren't about managing someone else's ego. So I asked him to dinner. He said yes. And from there, things unfolded the way real things do. Not in a rush, not in a blaze of passion meant to distract from insecurity, but in steady steps. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Evan had been watching from a distance. He never reached out, but word travels. Old coworkers talk. Social circles overlap. He knew about the shop. He knew I hadn't fallen apart. He knew I'd built something he once dismissed as impossible. And that's when the tension truly began to form. Not between me and Ryan. Between Evan's fantasy and my reality. Because the more I moved forward, the more Evan's absence stopped feeling temporary. And that terrified him. I started noticing little things. A mutual acquaintance casually mentioning they'd run into Evan recently. A friend telling me he'd ask questions about how I was doing, financially, emotionally, personally. Questions he never asked when he was my husband. At first, I brushed it off. Then his message appeared. 13 months after he walked away. "I'm done finding myself." What he meant was, I didn't find anything better. And the moment he realized that, the silence between us stopped being neutral. It became charged. Because now there was something he wanted back. Something he assumed still belonged to him. And the worst part? He believed he could just step back into my life like no one else had earned a place there in his absence. The seed of conflict wasn't planted when he left. It was planted the moment he decided my life was something he could return to at his convenience. And soon, he was going to test that assumption in person. The doorbell rang at exactly 3 in the afternoon. That detail stuck with me later, how precise it was. Like he'd planned it. Like he believed showing up in the middle of the day would make everything feel casual, reasonable. As if this were just another conversation we'd postponed. Not the aftermath of a marriage he abandoned for over a year. "I'll get it," Ryan called from the kitchen. He was experimenting with a new recipe, something with garlic and butter that made the whole house smell warm and lived in. The sound of sizzling oil followed his footsteps as he walked toward the door. I stayed in the hallway, wiping my hands on a rag, already feeling that strange tightening in my chest, the kind that happens when your body recognizes a threat before your mind catches up. The door opened, then nothing. No greeting, no footsteps, no voices overlapping, just silence. The heavy kind, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your pulse thud in your ears. "Can I help you?" Ryan asked. His tone was polite, controlled, firm. I didn't need to see the porch to know who was standing there. I walked forward slowly. My ex-husband stood frozen on the doorstep, a small suitcase clenched in his hand like a prop he'd rehearsed with. His eyes were locked on Ryan, moving from his face to the kitchen towel draped over his shoulder, to the unmistakable ease of someone who belonged inside this space. All the color drained from Evan's face. "You," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" Ryan didn't flinch. "I live here," he said calmly. "Can I help you with something?" That was when Evan saw me, standing just behind Ryan, close enough that my presence couldn't be ignored, close enough that the reality he'd been avoiding snapped into focus. His expression shifted, shock folding into disbelief, disbelief sharpening into anger. "Are you serious right now?" he demanded, his voice climbing. "You're with him?" I stepped forward and placed my hand lightly on Ryan's shoulder. The gesture wasn't aggressive, it wasn't territorial. It was instinctive. "Yes," I said evenly. "Is there something you need?" "I texted you," Evans said, ignoring the question completely. "Did you even read them?" "I read the first one," I replied. That was enough. His mouth fell open slightly. "You didn't respond?" "No." He let out a laugh, but it came out brittle, sharp. "Wow. So that's it? You move him in? Him, of all people? You know how I felt about him." Ryan crossed his arms. "Actually, you never told me how you felt. You smiled to my face and talked behind my back. That's not feelings, that's being two-faced." Evan's face flushed red. "This is unbelievable. I leave for a year to work on myself and you replace me with someone from my own workplace." "My workplace?" I said calmly. "You quit 10 months ago, and you didn't leave to work on yourself. You left to see if you could do better." His eyes flicked between us. "We were married for 6 years. That means nothing to you?" "It meant something," I said, "right up until you said it didn't." "I made a mistake," he said, his voice cracking now. "People make mistakes. You're supposed to forgive mistakes in a marriage." Ryan cleared his throat. "You don't have a marriage anymore. You divorced her, remember?" Evan shot him a glare. "Nobody asked you." "You're standing at my door," Ryan replied calmly. "In my house. So, yes, you kind of did." Evan turned back to me, eyes wide. "You moved into his house?" "It's our house," I corrected. "We bought it together 3 months ago." The suitcase slipped from his fingers and hit the porch with a dull thud. 3 months, he whispered. "You've been together 3 months?" 7, I said. "We kept it private while we were building the business." "Business," he repeated slowly, like the word offended him. "Ryan and I are partners in several ways," I said. "This is insane," he snapped. "You're throwing away everything we built for someone you barely know." "I know him better in 7 months than I knew you in 6 years," I said quietly. "And we didn't build anything together. I built. You criticized. There's a difference." He stared at us, opening and closing his mouth like the words wouldn't line up fast enough. Finally, he pointed at Ryan. "He's not better than me." Ryan smiled, not kindly. "I don't need to be better than you. I just need to be present." Evan picked up his suitcase, hands shaking. "You're going to regret this." "I regret a lot of things," I said. "Marrying someone who saw me as a backup plan is one of them. This," I gestured between Ryan and myself, "isn't something I'll regret." He turned to leave, then stopped. "When this falls apart, don't come looking for me." "Wouldn't dream of it." We watched him walk to his car, throw the suitcase into the back seat, and peel out of the driveway. Ryan closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling. "Well," he said, "that was awkward." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity finally hit me. "He brought a suitcase," I said. "He actually thought he could move back in." Ryan shook his head, smiling. The look on his face when I answered the door was priceless. And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. After the door closed, the house didn't return to normal right away. It took a moment for the silence to settle into something breathable again. Ryan leaned back against the door, rubbing the back of his neck, like he was trying to shake off the tension that had followed Evan inside. "Well," he said lightly, forcing a small smile, "that was not how I expected my afternoon to go." I nodded, but my body hadn't caught up to my mind yet. My hands were trembling. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed when I tried to fold the rag I'd been holding, and my fingers didn't quite cooperate. Adrenaline still buzzed under my skin, my heartbeat loud in my ears. I'm sorry, I said automatically. Ryan frowned. For what? For him, for the surprise, for... I gestured vaguely toward the door. All of that. He shook his head immediately. Don't apologize. You didn't invite him. You didn't encourage it. You handled it calmly. That's all that matters. Calm. That was the word everyone always used for me. What they didn't see was the storm underneath, the rapid calculations, the emotional inventory I was taking without meaning to. Why did his voice still affect me like that? Why did a part of me feel the urge to explain myself, even now? Why did I care that he looked hurt? I followed Ryan back into the kitchen. The sauce he'd been making had thickened too much, edges sticking to the pan. He turned down the heat and stirred absently. Do you think he'll try again? He asked. The question landed heavier than it sounded. I don't know, I said honestly. He doesn't like losing, especially not publicly. Ryan glanced at me. You okay? That was when it hit. Not the anger, not the satisfaction. The grief. Not for Evan, but for the version of myself who would have blamed herself for this a year ago. The woman who would have replayed every word, wondering if she'd been too cold, too harsh, too quick to move on. I sat down at the table, pressing my palms flat against the wood. I keep wondering, I admitted quietly, if I missed something back then, some sign that he was already gone long before he left. Ryan turned off the stove and sat across from me. You didn't miss it. You just didn't want to believe it. I swallowed. He said I was holding him back. Ryan met my eyes. People who say that are usually angry they couldn't control you. The words settled deep, because they rang true. Evan never said, I'm unhappy with us. He said, I can't become who I want to be with you. He turned his restlessness into my responsibility. I didn't yell at him today, I said slowly. I didn't even feel the urge to. That's growth, Ryan said. Not numbness, growth. That night after dinner, my phone buzzed. Then again. And again. 6 new messages, some apologetic, some angry, some desperate enough to make my chest tighten. I didn't open them. Ryan watched me set the phone face down on the counter. You want to read them? No, I said, not right now. Because I knew the pattern. First, Evan would soften. Then he'd blame himself, briefly. Then he'd pivot. You pushed me away. You changed. You didn't fight for us. Reading them wouldn't give me closure. It would just reopen a door I'd already closed. The next morning, while we were having breakfast, my phone buzzed again. Ryan glanced at it and raised an eyebrow. Persistent. That's not persistence, I said, pouring coffee. That's panic. Do you want me to answer the door next time too? He asked gently. I smiled faintly. Let's hope there isn't a next time. But deep down I knew better. Evan wasn't done because he hadn't gotten what he came for. He didn't want conversation. He wanted reassurance. He wanted proof that he still mattered enough to disrupt my peace. And the hardest part? A small, quiet voice inside me still wanted to explain, to justify, to soften the blow so he wouldn't feel so rejected. That voice scared me, because that voice was old. That voice belonged to the woman I used to be. So I made a decision right there at the kitchen table. I wouldn't let guilt write another chapter of my life. If Evan came back, it wouldn't be to negotiate my boundaries. It would be to test them. And this time, I was ready. I should have known Evan wouldn't stop. Men like him rarely do, not because they love deeply, but because they can't stand being replaced in a story they thought they still controlled. For 2 days after the doorstep incident, my phone stayed quiet. No messages, no calls, no unknown numbers lighting up the screen. I allowed myself to hope, briefly, that he'd finally absorbed the message. I was wrong. It started subtly. Ryan and I were in his garage late one afternoon, going over invoices spread across the desk. The shop was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional metallic clink from the tool wall. You know, Ryan said casually, scrolling through a spreadsheet. Someone from the dealership asked me today how the business was doing. I looked up. Who? He shrugged. Didn't say. Just a heard you started your own thing kind of question. Something tightened in my chest, because there were only a handful of people who still cared enough to ask, and only one person who would twist curiosity into ammunition. That evening, the messages resumed. Different number. You've changed. The woman I married wouldn't treat me like this. We have history. I stared at the words longer than I wanted to admit. History. He always said it like it was currency, like shared years were something he could cash in whenever it suited him. I didn't respond. I blocked the number. 5 minutes later, another message came through from a new one. I saw your car wasn't in the driveway today. Are you avoiding me? That one crossed a line. Ryan watched my face change as I read it. What? He's watching the house, I said quietly. Ryan's jaw tightened. That's not okay. No, I agreed. It's not. The next morning, a car sat parked across the street when I left for work. Not pulling in, not driving by. Just sitting there. I didn't need to see the driver's face to know. He's escalating, Ryan said later, after I told him. He thinks proximity equals leverage. By that afternoon, the messages shifted tone. Less apologetic, more accusatory. You moved on too fast. He's just a rebound. You're throwing away 6 years for convenience. Convenience. The word stung because it revealed how little Evan had understood me at all. Ryan wasn't convenient. Ryan was present. He was consistent. He showed up without needing to be begged or praised or managed. That night, my phone rang. Unknown number. I didn't answer. A voicemail followed. I know you're angry, Evan said, his voice shaky, rehearsed. But adults talk. You owe me that. 6 years doesn't just disappear. I deleted it without replying. Ryan watched quietly. You okay? I'm angry, I admitted. Not at him, at myself, for ever thinking I owed him access to my peace. The pressure didn't stop with me. 2 days later, Ryan came home with tension in his shoulders. She showed up at the shop, he said. My stomach dropped. What? Didn't cause a scene. Just asked questions. Asked if we were struggling. Asked if we were worried about rent. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. Of course she did. She wanted to plant doubt, Ryan continued. In me, in herself, in anyone who'd listen. And I told her our contracts just expanded into 3 more counties. He smiled faintly. She didn't like that. That night, Evan called again, this time from a number I hadn't blocked yet. I answered on speaker. Congratulations on the business expansion, he said quickly, like he was afraid I'd hang up. Ryan told me. Why are you calling? I asked calmly. I wanted to be nice. No, I corrected. You wanted to see if I'd soften. A pause. We were supposed to build things together, he said. You talked about this shop when we were married. You told me it was a dead-end hobby, I replied. You said working with my hands was beneath me. I was trying to protect you. No, I said. You were trying to control the narrative of what success looked like. His breathing grew heavier. So now everything good in your life is because of him? No, I said evenly. It's because of me. He just didn't stand in my way. Silence. That's when I knew. This wasn't about reconciliation anymore. It was about Evan losing power over my time, my emotions, my sense of self. And he was panicking. When I hung up, Ryan reached for my hand. He's unraveling. Yes, I said, and he's going to try something bigger. Because people who can't control the ending will always try to hijack the middle. And I could feel it. We were heading toward a breaking point, one that would force everything into the open. I didn't expect the lowest point to feel so quiet. There was no screaming match, no dramatic confrontation in the street. No final, explosive argument that would let me release everything I'd been holding back. Instead, it came on a Tuesday night, after a long day at the shop, when the house was finally still. Ryan had fallen asleep on the couch, one arm draped over the cushion, the TV murmuring softly in the background. I stood in the kitchen alone, rinsing a mug that didn't need rinsing, staring out the window without really seeing anything. That was when the exhaustion hit. Not physical, emotional. The kind that sinks into your bones and makes even standing feel heavy. For weeks, I'd been strong, calm, measured. I'd drawn boundaries, blocked numbers, refused conversations that would go nowhere. I'd told myself I was past this, that Evan no longer had access to me. But strength is not the absence of pain. It's just the decision to carry it quietly. I checked my phone, something I'd promised myself I wouldn't do late at night. No new messages. And somehow that hurt more than the harassment. Because it meant he'd finally gone silent. Not because he understood, but because he was regrouping. I sat at the kitchen table and pressed my fingertips against my temples, trying to slow my thoughts. Memories surfaced uninvited. The early days of my marriage. The version of Evan who laughed easily. The man who once told me I was his anchor. I wondered, briefly, dangerously, if I'd been too unforgiving. If maybe I should have explained more, softened my words, given him a cleaner ending. The thought scared me. Because it meant a part of me still felt responsible for his feelings. I hated that. I hated that after everything. After abandonment, after disrespect, after entitlement, he still had the power to make me question myself in the quiet moments. That was my breaking point. Not anger. Doubt. I stood up abruptly, chair scraping against the floor, and walked into the bathroom. I turned on the light and stared at my reflection. I looked older than I had a year ago. Not worn, but sharpened. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there before, a steadiness in my gaze that came from having survived something you never expected to survive. Why do you still care? I asked my reflection softly. The answer came immediately. Because you loved him honestly. And loving honestly always leaves a mark. Tears welled up, not the dramatic kind, just a few that slipped down quietly, almost apologetically. I wiped them away before they could fall. I refused to let this become a moment of weakness that rewrote the truth. The truth was simple. Evan didn't want to come back because he loved me. He wanted to come back because his life hadn't turned out the way he imagined, and mine had. That realization didn't feel empowering. It felt lonely, because it meant I had truly outgrown him. And outgrowing someone you once built your life around is a kind of grief no one warns you about. I walked back into the living room. Ryan stirred slightly but didn't wake. I sat on the floor beside the couch, leaning my back against it, letting my head rest just close enough to feel his presence, not needing words. Just grounding. That was the moment I understood something crucial. I wasn't struggling because I missed Evan. I was struggling because this was the final severing, the last emotional thread pulling loose. And it hurt. But pain doesn't mean regret. Sometimes it's just proof that something mattered before it ended. I took a deep breath and made a quiet promise to myself. I would not reach out. I would not reopen the door. I would not seek closure from someone who had already shown me who he was. If Evan came back again, it would not be to debate the past. It would be to end this, cleanly, publicly, and finally. And I would be strong enough to do it, even if it hurt. The turning point didn't come with a warning. It arrived disguised as opportunity. A month after the silence settled in, after the stalking stopped, after the calls ended, after I'd almost convinced myself Evan had finally accepted reality, Ryan and I received an invitation to speak at a local business networking event. Small businesses, shared success stories, a room full of entrepreneurs, investors, and people looking for inspiration. I almost said no, not because I was afraid of public speaking, but because something in my gut hesitated, like my instincts were tapping my shoulder, reminding me that unfinished chapters have a way of resurfacing when you least expect them. Ryan noticed. "We don't have to do it," he said. "The shop's doing fine." I looked at the invitation again. 50 people, exposure, credibility. "No," I said finally. "We'll go." Because hiding isn't healing. The event was held in a hotel conference room, neutral lighting, rows of chairs, the quiet hum of ambition filling the air. We told our story honestly. How the business started, the risks, the mistakes, the trust it took to build something together without ego getting in the way. People listened. They asked thoughtful questions. For a moment, I forgot about everything else, until I felt it. That familiar sensation, being watched. I turned my head slowly, and there he was. Evan stood near the back wall, arms crossed, eyes locked on us. My stomach tightened, but something else rose to meet it. Calm. Ryan saw him at the same time. He leaned toward me slightly. "She's here." "I know." "What do you want to do?" "Nothing," I said quietly. "Let him watch." Because this time, I wasn't afraid of the audience. During the Q&A, someone asked how we balance business and personal relationships without letting one damage the other. Before I could answer, Evan's voice cut through the room. "That's an interesting question," he said loudly, "considering she was married to someone else just a year ago." The room went silent. Every head turned. The moderator cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "Sir, if you have a question—" "I don't need a microphone," Evan interrupted, stepping forward. "I just think people deserve to know the whole story." My heart pounded, but not with panic. With resolve. Ryan stood calmly. "Actually, the divorce was finalized 7 months before we started dating, but thanks for the clarification." Evan's face flushed. "You were waiting in the wings." "I was living my life," Ryan said evenly. "You should try it instead of following your ex to professional events." A ripple of awkward laughter moved through the room. I stood up, and that was the moment everything shifted. "Yes," I said clearly. "I was married. Yes, I got divorced. My ex-husband decided he needed to find himself and left for 13 months. When he came back expecting everything to be the same, he discovered life doesn't pause for people who walk away." Evan stared at me, stunned. "You replaced me," he said, his voice shaking. "No," I replied calmly. "You left a position vacant. Someone else filled it. That's not replacement. That's consequence." There was nothing left to hide behind. No private conversation, no emotional leverage, no illusion of control. Evan looked around the room, at the faces watching, judging, understanding. Then his shoulders sagged. "I hope you're happy," he said quietly. "I am," I answered. He turned and walked out. The room stayed silent for a beat. Then someone started clapping. Others joined. Not because they loved drama, but because they recognized truth. As Ryan and I drove home later, neither of us spoke for a few minutes. "That felt final," he said at last. "Yes," I agreed. "It was." Because power doesn't come from winning an argument. It comes from standing in your truth without flinching. And for the first time, Evan had no place left in mine. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It never does. It came in fragments. Quiet confirmations that the story Evan had been telling himself was finally unraveling. The day after the event, the shop was busier than usual. A few people who'd attended stopped by, curious, supportive, impressed by what we'd built. One man even joked that the panel discussion was the most honest thing he'd heard all year. Evan's attempt to expose me had backfired. Instead of planting doubt, he'd exposed himself. Ryan noticed it first. "You realize," he said, wiping his hands on a rag, "he humiliated himself in front of 50 people who talked to other people." I nodded. Word travels. And it did. Within a week, I heard from an old colleague, someone who used to sit 2 offices down from Evan back when we were married. "People are talking," she said carefully, not in a good way, about him. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. Evan had always cared deeply about perception, about being seen as composed, respectable, successful. Showing up uninvited and emotionally unraveling in public wasn't part of that image. The calls didn't resume. The messages stopped. But the consequences kept spreading. I learned through mutual acquaintance that his new relationship, the one he'd hinted at, the one he'd used as proof that he was doing fine, had ended quietly not long after the event. Apparently, she didn't appreciate being compared to an ex who clearly still occupied his thoughts. I felt no satisfaction hearing that. Just inevitability. People don't build new foundations while standing in old ruins. Ryan and I felt the shift too, but in the opposite direction. Our business gained momentum. Contracts expanded. Conversations about a second location stopped being hypothetical and started becoming logistical. At home, things felt lighter. No more checking windows. No more bracing for confrontation. No more emotional static in the air. One evening, as we were cooking together, Ryan glanced at me and said, "You know, she hasn't tried to contact you since that night." "I know," I replied. "How does that feel?" I thought about it. Relief, yes. Peace, definitely. But also something else. Finality. "Like the echo finally stopped," I said. Weeks passed. Then 6. And just when I thought the chapter was fully closed, a letter arrived. An actual handwritten letter. My name, written in Evan's familiar script, stared up at me from the envelope like a ghost from another life. Ryan handed it to me without comment. "Your call." I opened it slowly. 3 pages, front and back. Apologies, explanations, justifications disguised as insight. He wrote about his fear, his confusion, how leaving had been a mistake, how he'd realized too late what he'd lost, how he wished he could go back, not just to me, but to the man he used to be when we were together. The final paragraph asked for coffee. Neutral ground. Closure. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and set it down. "What are you thinking?" Ryan asked. "That he spent 6 weeks writing this," I said softly, hoping I'd feel something. "And do you?" I shook my head. "Not what he wants." I picked up my phone and typed a single message to the last number of his that hadn't been blocked. "You had 13 months to decide what you wanted. I used that time to build something better. There's no closure needed here because I closed that door when you walked out. I hope you find what you're looking for, but you won't find it with me. Please don't contact me again." I sent it. Then I blocked the number. The response came immediately from another number. "That's it? After everything?" Blocked. Another buzz. "You're making a mistake." Blocked. Another. "Fine. Have your life." Blocked. I turned my phone off completely. Ryan wrapped his arms around me. "Think this is really the end?" "Yes," I said quietly, because this time I didn't leave the door cracked. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, because the truth had done what it always does eventually. It returned everything to its rightful place. 6 weeks passed without a single ripple. No messages, no unknown numbers, no cars lingering across the street. Life didn't just return to normal. It settled into something better. The shop stayed busy, not the frantic kind of busy that drains you, but the steady rhythm of work that feels earned. Ryan and I spent our days side by side, arguing over logistics, laughing over small mistakes, planning things that used to feel too risky to say out loud. In the evenings, we cooked together, sometimes in silence, sometimes with music playing softly in the background. The kind of silence that doesn't beg to be filled because it already feels complete. One night, as we were sitting on the back porch, watching the sky darken, Ryan asked a question he hadn't asked before. "Do you ever miss him?" I thought about it longer than I expected. "I miss who I thought he was," I said finally, "not who he turned out to be." Ryan nodded. He didn't push. He never did. That was the difference. Healing didn't come in a dramatic moment. It came in small realizations, like noticing I no longer flinched when my phone buzzed, like realizing I spoke freely again about my ideas, my boundaries, my future, like understanding that love shouldn't require you to shrink to keep someone comfortable. Evan wanted me to wait. He wanted me to remain frozen in the version of life he left behind, available if he changed his mind, grateful if he returned. But life doesn't work that way. People don't get to abandon you, explore their options, and then reclaim you because the world didn't deliver what they expected. Love is not a waiting room, and marriage is not something you step out of and step back into when it suits you. I didn't win. I didn't defeat him. I simply chose myself and kept choosing myself, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it hurt. That was the real power shift. If there's one thing I'd want anyone watching this to understand, it's this. When someone leaves you to find themselves, believe them. Let them go. Don't pause your life to make room for their return. The right people don't need to leave to figure out your value. They already know it. As for me, I didn't end up alone. I ended up at home, in a life built on mutual respect, honesty, and presence. And that, more than anything else, is how I know I made the right choice.